Proceedings are now resumed. I'd like to call our next witness into the chamber, Mrs. Nicola Anderson Wildman. Morning, Ms. Wildman. Please sit to the right here at any one of the empty chairs and desks.
Good afternoon.
Good morning, ma'am, and thank you very much for attending this hearing today on the construction of the high schools. For the record, would you please state your name and your position?
My name is Nicola Anderson Wildman. I'm the Chief Financial Officer for the Ministry of Education, Employment, and Gender Affairs. I must beg your pardon. I've been having a hoarse throat for 2 weeks now, but I will definitely attempt to answer all your questions as clearly as possible.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wildman. We normally give witnesses before the committee an opportunity to make an opening statement if they would like to. You're not obliged to, but I'd like to extend the same courtesy to you.
Thank you, sir. I have no opening statement to make.
Thank you very much. Members of the committee, Ms. Wildman, this witness is available for your questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you. Mrs. Anderson Wildman, if you could, just to help us set the stage, let us know how long you've been in the role that you're currently in, and if you could also describe that role and how you perceive your responsibility with regards to ministry's overall responsibility for ensuring that government programs are delivered effectively and that they achieve the results that they're designed to achieve. That being, ensuring that they're managed with due regard for the value for money.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chairman, I have been with the ministry from mid-2008-9. As such, I was not here for the inception of the project, the new schools project, that is, in 2005. When I came into the ministry in 2008-9, the situation was where we had several years of backlogged accounts and financial reporting. Also, while the project was already in play, I came into that situation. So we had to. So that was the initial state. So I've been with the ministry from that time to now. In terms of my responsibilities, generally speaking, I am responsible for the annual financial reporting, and I'm also, as a member of the senior management team of the ministry, involved in providing relevant and reliable information for decision-making purposes. More specific to capital projects, I'm not currently involved in the procurement, as it were, but any transaction, whether for capital or operational purposes, I ensure that whether it's a PMFL or the relevant accounting standards or the practice that we have established in the ministry, that those are upheld. So that is my role as it relates to my function in the ministry, and more specific as it relates to any major capital project that we undertake. Oh, thank you.
Mr. Conley, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, through you to the Chief Financial Officer, does the ministry have a short, medium, long-term capital works projects plan? And if not, why not?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, just to repeat the question, Councillor Connolly, just to make sure I understand it, you're asking if the ministry has in place a plan for major capital projects, correct? Depending on speaking from my capacity, because not being the second party, but generally we have, on a yearly basis, we review when we establish our budgets, various meetings are held to establish what our projects are, whether they're continuing or what the project will be for that year. That's the initial step that we take in establishing what the goals are, and that, of course, is a consultative approach. It's not just done at the ministry, also incorporate HODs as well in that process. From that process, then more detail is developed depending on the plan, whether it's in the case of the restart of the new John Gray High School, there's an enhanced plan that will be developed for that. But I'm speaking, as I said, as a second party. I'm not integrally involved in the establishment of those more detailed plans, but at the outset, I do meet as a part of the senior management team for us to review, to go through the planning phase of what the goals are for that particular year or the next few years.
And just a follow-up to that, in terms of your role as Chief Financial Officer, as part of the senior management team, etc., in your opinion, would plans, especially in areas where, say, for construction, you probably don't have that expertise in your team, especially large-scale construction. So having a plan, being able to talk about the strategy, the financing, the other management aspects of that, and give advice, I guess, in your role as the financial side of that management team, could that have helped some of the concerns raised in the report and going forward, because there are other major capital projects works involving the ministry? Would that help in terms of layout, advice, the financial aspect in terms of vis-a-vis the other areas of the budget? Because what I'm trying to get to is, your role from a strategic standpoint, and also best practice going forward, so that in here and by the acting chief officer's report and the PWD report or testimony before, it seems that in these projects in particular, there was a lot of rush work, meaning, we need to get this done, we need to get it done right away. We're going to go out to tender, but we know we're not going to get a proper tender process because people also know we're under the gun. Blah, it seemed like it exacerbated the issues, and from the get-go, the players knew that costs were going to be overrun because of the crunch. And I'm saying, how do you stop the crunch or plan for the crunch?
Thank you, sir. Through you, Mr. Chairman. What we have done in terms of, well, just to differentiate, because there is an issue of project management accounting versus financial accounting. So as it relates to project management accounting, that doesn't fall under my ambit, as it were. But in terms of financial accounting and financial advice, I have been consulted at different points, or I have offered my opinion where I found it necessary to guide some of the processes. In terms of your specific question, in terms of lessons learned to going forward, I believe that we could, through enhanced practices and policies, potentially have a more detailed or structured methodology. And I think what has been happening through the development of the procurement law, and also in terms of the offices that are being created where there are some strict policies, some guidelines, some requirement for business planning before, which would involve a financial component. I think that's an excellent step of establishing it more formally. But so definitely I think that if we move along that line, that it certainly will be beneficial, not just for our ministry, but certainly for government and also for the public in terms of accountability.
Yeah, and I would encourage you to make a formal recommendation of such, because if I'm looking at record keeping and financial oversight, and where going forward the financial information and the management information on major capital projects is going to reside, I think as chief financial officers, and again, I'm making this specifically to you in this setting, but I also, for the listening audience and people there would think that as a whole, chief financial officers play a very integral role in any of this sort of management, et cetera. I mean, and I'm just equating it both in government and outside of government, where that chief financial officer is, the whole of the purse, the kind of strategic voice in terms of anything financial. When these things come to play, I would expect and I hope that you would be called in very early and not after the fact. And in terms of when I'm reading this report and I'm hearing that certain pieces of information that were requested by the Auditor General were long in coming, or sometimes never came, or those sorts of things. So from a repository of financial data, management data, etc., I'd like to understand more about those processes and how the past projects and how they were handled are now hopefully positively influencing process and procedures going forward, so that documentation, transparency, all those things are kept. And I'm just asking whether or not that's your role and CFO's roles, or whose role in any ministry is that?
Okay, through you, Mr. Chairman, there's a fine line between project management and financial management. My current responsibility is not for project management, but in the same breath, that doesn't mean that I don't have to weigh in, or if I observe something that may be outside of the context of the correct practice, that I will not raise that. In terms of what has happened in the past, what I have observed, the New Schools project started in 2005 officially, maybe a few years before, there were discussions about it. In coming into the ministry, there were areas of weakness that I found, and the audit office as well, they disclaimed the accounts for several years for that period. So that gives you an indication of the state of affairs as they were that I came into. But what we have done in terms of what falls under my ambit is to certainly improve on that situation where we do regular reporting from a financial accounting perspective as it relates to all our capital projects on a weekly basis, in summary. And along with that, we, with our financial reporting package, we have to provide, in summary, what expenditure occurred for that year for major capital projects against the budget. So that is also tabled in the Legislative Assembly. So, so when I came in, there was little or no reporting done. Since I've been there, we have been doing reporting and we have been audited over the years. So that's some amount of improvement there. In relation to the record keeping, in the audit report, they seem to have more been focusing on the project management file keeping, so I could not speak to that. But in the same breath, you had asked me in terms of what do we foresee for the future. So I do think there is room for improvement in terms of the project management accounting and how government as a whole record transactions in that respect, so as to make the process a lot easier and easily to retrieve information, to provide relevant reports as needed to the decision makers. So, but also to interlink that with the financial reporting mechanism that we have, and also the project management tools which may be outside of the financial management system that we currently have in place. So definitely, yes, I would agree that there is room for improvement in that area.
And just along those lines about the systems that you have in place, do you agree that the IRIS system is not designed or capable to account and manage for this large type construction exercise?
Through you, Mr. Chairman. In my humble opinion, and I don't think I stand alone in this respect, the current accounting system that we have could be improved. Currently, for our ministry, we don't have a separate tool for project accounting. So, and there are no established reports for project reporting that we currently have. So in order to assist in providing any information, it's strictly just about spend on a project. It is done very, reports have to be literally made from scratch. A lot of data is used and has to be reviewed in order to create very simple reports. And that has been a major drawback of the system, not just as it relates to projects, but generally speaking. So I do think that is an area for improvement government-wide, and I don't think that I would stand alone in saying that. I think the audit office would also agree with that.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I beg your indulgence to just, we have the Auditor General's team and staff here, acting Auditor General's team and staff here. And this is me just being a quote-unquote layman. I'm not an accountant. I never wished to be one, but but in your professional opinion, what should a chief officer, a chief financial officer's role be in these types of projects, from prior to them coming into play, during them, and post them? What does that look like? What in best practice?
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chairman. The way we see the chief officer's role, just in regards to that, obviously you had touched on kind of the short-term, medium-term, long-term budgeting process, and knowing what's coming down. What I see is the chief financial officer's role is to be able to strategically advise the chief officer, okay, they need to be in constant communication, because the chief financial officer needs to know what plans are in place for such these projects of infrastructure. And I would hope the chief officer would place trust in the chief financial officer to start formulating the dollar amounts around what these potential projects would cost, and coming up with that so that you can have a longer term view of what these infrastructure costs may be in the future. In regards to, so I guess it's seeing that strategic value that the chief financial officer could bring. The other area is, during a project, I would also see the chief financial officer hopefully being able to and having the authority to step in when they see things are not going in accordance with the budget. And again, having that good relationship with the chief officer so that they can work together as a team in saying, okay, we need to change things here and bring to account how we can bring this project either back into line with the budget, or how we're going to plan for it going forward. Do we need more supplemental appropriations? So that's all done before the money's spent. In regards to the systems, IRIS is an Oracle financial-based system. It is what I would call a fairly Cadillac system for accounting. There are features within it that can be used for project accounting. So those just need to be utilized by the CFOs, or Treasury would have to turn on certain features that may be able to be used for better project accounting. Again, we need better guidelines overall from a government perspective to help the CFOs say, okay, if they're going to be the ones in charge of accounting for the projects, the guidelines need to be better. How do you account for them? Or will it fall under the project management office as well? So I think some of those things still need to be ironed out as well, from my perspective.
And then just passing it back then to the CFO, in that, would you agree with the Acting Auditor General's kind of statement as to your role and or the best practice role, so to speak? And do you think that the ministry that you're involved in and other ministries also see that very important kind of strategic partnership advisor kind of scenario? Do they see that across the board for CFOs? Because and I'll just give a statement before you answer, if you'll allow me, in that to me, the CFO is probably the most important link in all of this, because at the end of the day, from a professional standpoint, they should have the authority and the gravitas to say, this is going off track. Let's have a huddle and have a meeting, and let's get this back on track, or put in, the supplementaries, et cetera, appropriations, et cetera, but, documenting it all along the way so it doesn't take off like a runaway, train. Right?
Through you, Mr. Chairman. My role as I mentioned earlier, does involve advice to the chief officer, minister, and the senior management team. So that has occurred and that continues to occur. Generally speaking, if we see that a project or, whether it's a major project or a minor project, going in the direction, or if we see things that come across my desk that seem to be outside of what the original plan is, then I do, through the proper mechanism, have those type of discussions with the relevant parties, and we determine the best solution. So that is something that has occurred since I joined in 2008 till now. And also in terms of the more strategic involvement, while that has been limited, I will say, I'm certain that we can enhance on that process in terms of, as it relates to each project. Of course, it would have to be in the context of what the PMFL, I know the PMFL is currently going through some adjustments as well, so it may be me, maybe the context of another financial officer. But regardless, just to be clear that I have always had that opportunity and have provided strategic advice to the powers that be, whether it's the minister, chief officer, to cabinet, as it relates to varying decisions, whether it's on major capital projects. However, the final decisions do not rest with me. Each CFO in each ministry will has a similar role. We are not the final say. We do have some significant amount of power in terms of our voice, and we have the law to back us, and we also have, in terms of checks and balances, we have the audit office sometimes to back us up as well in terms of what we may be trying to enhance, and the Ministry of Finance as well. So that certainly has been the case, and that has been, and it has been established.
Thank you for that answer. And I think it's one of the, we've highlighted that the CFO role is one of the most important components in any type of project, especially where money is involved. With the new capital projects office, et cetera, how much interaction do you have with the Auditor General's office and that office when it comes to major capital projects personally? Or do you always have to go through up the chain, so to speak, and then they liaise? Or can you pick up the phone and say, I need guidance, I need support, I have observations? Can you explain that, your relationship with those two branches as it relates?
The audit office and what was
the projects office, the newly formed capital projects office.
Okay, through you, Mr. Chairman. The audit office, we have, through our financial accounting, our auditors on the financial accounting side, at times we may liaise with them to get their opinion on certain issues, whether it's related to the capital project or in dealing with a specific type of transaction that's a bit unusual, just to make sure that we're on the same page. We do that with our external auditors. We also do that with our internal auditors as well. And that's not just myself as CFO. We do that as management, because we're certainly along the line in terms that our aim is to certainly maintain the law and to ensure that the proper procedures are in place. In terms of the new project office, I have not been very involved in the establishment of that office, so I have not had much communication with them at this point. But I do look forward to, as that office is relatively new as well, and policies and procedures and laws are being established. So I do, however, look forward to, in the near future, having some more involvement in that process. But at this point, it has been limited.
Mr. Chairman, if I could
Yeah, first, go
provide
ahead,
some
sir.
information to the committee, which I hope would be helpful and informative. Just to say that, as you will know, sir, the government asks for the establishment of a public management and finance law review committee. The committee met over a considerable period of time. It concluded with a report that contained about 40 recommendations and conclusions. One of those recommendations, Mr. Chairman and committee members, involved capital budgeting. And in brief, the recommendations of the committee were, was in this particular area, capital budgeting, was that the present details that we see in the annual budget documents certainly can be improved upon. So the committee went on to say that what it would like to see in the annual budget documents is the life of a project to completion be explained, how much, so setting out in different fiscal years in the future what it would cost to complete the project in terms of capital costs, what the operational costs are that are connected and will result from that capital project being put into operation. Information such as how was the project to be financed, whether it was going to be from revenues and cash reserves or whether it was going to be from borrowings. Obviously descriptions about the project, a description about the project, information about the benefits to be derived from the project. So certainly that was a recommendation of the committee, and it was a very important one. And Mr. Chairman and committee members, the House has received, the Legislative Assembly has received a Public Management and Finance Amendment Bill, which I believe will be debated when the House meets in mid-October, mid this month. Those were very few of the committee's recommendations, and the capital budgeting is not a part of this particular bill coming up for consideration in October. But there is, by all means, meant to be a second amendment bill to be brought to the Legislative Assembly for the other recommendations of the committee. And capital budgeting is meant to be, a part of the second amendment bill to be brought to the House. And so, Mr. Chair and members, the current situation, as we all know, is that the capital appropriations, like the operating expenditure appropriations, they lapse at the end of a fiscal year and don't carry forward into the following year. And I think what that has resulted in is a mindset that the information that is presented in the annual budget documents are restricted generally to 1 year periods of time, and so that's something that we certainly want to change in the future. And the best way of changing it is to actually specify it in law. I don't think, strictly speaking, there isn't any particular feature of the public management and finance law at the moment that says you can't, an agency cannot provide information about future years, and there isn't that legal restrictions that an agency can't do that. But the fact that there isn't a stated requirement that the agency shall produce information about future years means that it tends to stop at the 1 year mark and does not go beyond that. So I hope that, Mr. Chairman and committee members is helpful in saying that capital budgeting And therefore, by implication, Mr. Chairman, reports on financial reporting on capital projects in the future should take a much longer term view than just a 1 year period of time.
Thank you, Financial Secretary, for those comments. Mr. Rubin, you have some comments you'd like to add?
Yes, just following on from the Financial Secretary's comments through you, Mr. Chair. We have commented, as you, or not we, in some of the reports, the previous Auditor General has commented significantly on the financial framework and issues that he's seen that can be improved going forward. And of course, as the Financial Secretary said, the PMFL Review Committee has made many recommendations, and that's now manifested itself in proposed amendments to the PMFL. Having said that, it's always been our contention that the law does not have to prescribe such detailed procedures and to ensure that good practices are implemented by the government in terms of its financial management of public resources. It does not have to be prescribed always. It can always, there should be other ways that the Financial Secretary should have in order to direct organizations within the government to prepare, for example, more robust operational plans that provide the Legislative Assembly with the ability to see where public funds will be spent. A good example of that is what we're discussing today, where it's necessary, where it's desirable, more than desirable, to have a long-term view of what your capital expenditures will be, not only in any particular ministry, but government-wide, so that when, for example, the Legislative Assembly meets, they can make decisions around priorities for which major capital projects should go forward, which shouldn't. So there's a lot of opportunities to do things through, I would call it, direction by key individuals throughout government, including the Financial Secretary, rather than pursuing them through legislative means, because I believe, as the Financial Secretary just alluded to, those take time. And if it's not required by law and people feel that they don't have to do it just because the law hasn't changed, I don't think that's a good reason for not doing the right thing in terms of managing public resources. That's just our view from the Office of the Auditor General.
Thank you. Mr. Connolly?
Just to follow up to the Financial Secretary, in terms of on page 39, in the conclusion, paragraph 129 of the audit report, have you had a chance to read that paragraph? And if you have, do you agree with the findings in that conclusion?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, the final sentence in paragraph 129 actually says that there's no accountability from ministries for the use of funds approved for major capital projects, especially those undertaken over a number of years. I think the best way for me to answer that question would be to seek an elaboration, unfortunately, from the Audit Office as to what is meant by there's no accountabilities from ministries to use their funds approved for major capital projects. Because obviously, ministries and portfolios, not just this ministry of education, they do report on their expenditures, both capital and operating. So I think there needs to be some elaboration as to why it's stated that way. It was not easy, particularly for me, to understand why it was written that way.
Acting Auditor General.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, in regards to that reference there that the funds approved for major capital projects, especially those taken over a number of years, that there's no accountability. What we see is basically in the annual report, we would be hoping to see more description around what is undertaken. Quite often what's tabled in the Legislative Assembly is just strictly the financial statements, and it's left up to the legislators to try and interpret what does this mean. And the other thing would be, if it's a project especially taken under several years, does the Legislative Assembly know the true cost of that project to the point and date when they submit the information to the Legislative Assembly or not? And do they know the full entire cost of what is to be projected of this project? Sometimes I feel that is missing at times, and there's not that strong accountability for the legislators to be able to see clearly, this is what the project has cost us to date, this is the expected cost, the lifetime cost of such a project if we put it in place.
If I'm hearing you correctly, then your feeling is that the absence of annual reports from ministries and departments and other entities, where there is some management discussion and analysis surrounding projects like this, where further detail is disclosed, is the real shortcoming here?
That would be definitely the shortcoming, is because right now we don't really see any annual reports from ministry portfolios describing those types of situations.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Not sure. If Mr. Rubin, do you have any further comments on that?
Just as well, it was discussed and by Councillor Connolly there as well, that when you put forward your plans to the legislature, there's opportunity to context that in terms of long-term strategies and what the total costs are of these major capital projects. So there's an opportunity during the planning process, and then as Mr. Harrison has said, at the end of the projects, to provide a full accountability back to the Legislative Assembly for these projects over their lifetime. At this time, as the Financial Secretary indicated, there's annual reporting back to the Legislative Assembly on the annual appropriations and the annual use of funds, but it doesn't context in the total cost of these projects. So there should be accountability for it, the entire project, not just the annual spending against the budget.
Okay. Mr. Connolly?
Thank you, and I apologize to the Chief Financial Officer because
We forgot.
directed the questions that way, but it was only to try to clarify or ask a further question to one of the statements made. Just in terms of advising this committee, how is the John Gray High School completion being done differently, and what is your role now in that project exercise, and going forward, and so we can understand what has changed from previous projects, or has anything changed?
Through you, Mr. Chairman. The main difference between the new phased approach to John Gray is that, one, we have an established framework in terms of, firstly, the FFR, and further to that, the requirements for certain business planning to happen before, also business plans, et cetera, that have been mentioned earlier. So that has been a very good step. In terms of my specific involvement, because the project is still in the early phases, I have not been significantly involved at this point, but I'm certain as it progresses, I will have more involvement in the initial phases and the continuing reporting on that as well.
Any other questions of this witness? If not, then I thank you very much for appearing before the committee today and giving your testimony. You're excused at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
I'd like to go ahead and call our next witness into the chamber. He is Mr. Tommy Ebanks, Facilities or Project Manager from the Ministry of Health. Ministry of Education, Employment and Gender Affairs, sorry. Mr. Tommy Ebanks. Good afternoon, Mr. Ebanks. Welcome to this hearing at the Public Accounts Committee. For the record, would you please state your name and your position?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. My name is Thomas Ebanks, and I'm the Facility and Project Manager for the Ministry of Education, Employment and Gender Affairs.
Thank you, sir. And for the record, we normally give members, witnesses, an opportunity to make an opening statement. I'd like to extend that courtesy to you at this time. If you do have one, you're not obliged to.
I have no opening statement.
Thank you, sir. Members of the committee, this witness is available for your questioning.
I do mind. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, through you. Mr. Ebanks, good afternoon. Could you please describe your role and your responsibilities with regard to the construction of the high schools and the primary schools from 2009 through 2013?
Mr. Chair, my role in the primary school was Project Liaison Officer for the Ministry of Education. In relation to the high schools, I acted as an assistant to the project managers, mainly with procurement of contracts and relating to Clifton Hunter and John Gray.
Steve Banks, were there any particular challenges that you faced in fulfilling your role in the management and the oversight of the projects at the Clifton Hunter and the John Gray High School?
Mr. Chairman, the main problem was time. I was working on the primary schools while trying to assist with the high school procurement. It was particularly difficult, I would say in mid-2010 to the end of 2010, while we were trying to develop all the contract documentation for the primary schools project.
Mr. Hugh?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, through you. Mr. Ebanks, talking about the primary school, and we heard from Mr. Jones earlier that you know they were given a short period of time to try and achieve the building of the schools, and I don't think there were proper processes in place as far as the budgets, etc. But I'm still struggling with I assume that you are, the report speaks that the ministry assigned one staff member to oversee the primary schools projects under the supervision of the deputy chief officer. Is that the role?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's correct. That was me.
Okay, good. How did this relationship work, where we see that there were, in the report, we see that there was an absence of formal records or discussions and decisions, and there were examples cited where the ministry requested numerous changes to the project through the contractors directly rather than through Public Works. We also saw situations where Public Works changed. I think there was a situation where there were changes to bid submissions done by Public Works. How did that? Was there weekly management meetings, or how did that relationship work as far as your liaison between Public Works and the ministry?
Mr. Chair, through you, I was mainly the liaison officer who basically any variations to the contracts as it related to the primary school came to me first. I vetted it, and then we met with the deputy chief officer to basically approve those. If there were any client-oriented changes to the project, they were also channeled through Public Works, who then did recommendations to us, and then there were responses, usually at the project meetings, which happened routinely and regularly on all the projects, all 4 projects that were ongoing. To the second part of your question, in regard to the tendering of and the procurement of consultants by Public Works, that was handled by them and basically forwarded to us for sign-off, because all contracts were entered by the ministry, not by Public Works. They only did the procurement side of it and forwarded it to the ministry for signature.
Mr. Chairman, through you, in these management meetings or in your reportings to the Deputy Chief Officer, were these meetings attended by the minister at the time?
Mr. Chair, could I ask Mr. Hugh to repeat that question, please?
Certainly, sorry. You said that when you vetted things from Public Works and took them to the Deputy Chief Officer or made your recommendations, in any of these meetings, and also you spoke about the management meetings, did the minister at the time attend those meetings?
Through you, Mr. Chair, the minister never attended any of the meetings with the chief officer and myself. Usually those were meetings that we had, and then information was passed back to Public Works. I can only recall one meeting, progress meeting on site, that the minister basically stopped into. He was visiting the school on one of his school inspections, and at the time we were having a progress meeting. He stopped in. As a result of him stopping in, he had to be put down on the list of people who was at the meeting.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, through you to Mr. Ebanks. Mr. Ebanks, in terms of the some of the observations of the Auditor General's office in their report, particularly pages 15 to 17, and then talking about the procuring construction consulting contracts. When you read that report, it sounds like there weren't proper checks and balances throughout, or there was an overriding of some of these checks and balances with regards to the tendering, the evaluation of bids, no utilization of tools available to mitigate risk, all these things. In your reading of this report, what do you say to those allegations specifically, and how has the process changed, if anything, if any, from what was deemed as missing in the previous the construction of schools versus the new John Gray construction?
Mr. Chair, through you, I have read the report in its entirety, and there were some things I didn't understand how it was written, to be quite honest. As it relates to some of the items contained in the report, we did have an independent quantity surveying and project management firm, BCQS, review the tendering process. And I'll read from their conclusion as to it relates to the tendering process. And it said, it would appear, and I quote from conclusion point 1, it would appear that the evaluation committee followed the correct tender process as determined by the Central Tenders Committee and subsequently awarded each of the contracts to the successful contractor based upon the scoring system proposed in the tender documentation. That's from an independent source who is very reliable in the Cayman Islands. Also, I do agree that the project that was undertaken, the SOC and the outline business case, was not conducted. However, that is one change that has been made as it relates to John Gray, and we do take the Auditor General's report that we should do that, and we are following his recommendation. Also, we are passing all capital projects to the Major Capital Office to be basically project managed going forward, so we do take his report on board as it relates to that.
Thank you, Mr. Eubanks. In terms of your role then going forward with the building of the schools, what would be your day-to-day management responsibilities and of the construction contracts, etc.?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think the acting chief officer outlined what the new procedure will be and the hiring of the new senior project manager to basically do the day-to-day project management of John Gray, as well as the amalgamation of schools on Cayman Brac. I think we're still determining what my role would be, but I currently sit on the steering committee for the John Gray and the Brac amalgamation. So I haven't been told exactly what my role would be going forward.
But is it safe to say, based on your involvement in the last project, that there have been lessons learned, and going forward, those lessons learned would presumably be put down in on paper somewhere, and this is how not to do it. Because I mean, I won't comment on my personal opinions on all the overruns, et cetera. But what I would say is that, you know, when reading this report, if people haven't learned lessons from this, then, you know, we're all kind of doomed going forward, because it was an exercise. If you take this report in its entirety, it was an exercise on just how not to do it because of all the different constraints, the timing, the involvement of these disparate parties, etc. So this should be a manual to kind of, you know, ensure value for money, proper procedures, proper roles and responsibilities, but ultimately accountability. Because as a committee member and as an elected member of government, to see if this were to happen again in our lifetime, that would be too short of a time to replicate some of the comitative errors.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, we've learned tremendous amount of lessons on ways not to do stuff, and especially in a complex project such as these projects were, especially as it relates to the new high schools. We have documented all of the things we think went wrong. We've also looked at the value engineering that had taken place and all of the fixes we had to do. They have all been documented, and my involvement with the steering committee is to basically shed some light on all of those things that are lessons we learned and things we would like to do different to ensure John Gray is delivered in a traditional manner. I think the chief officer or the acting chief officer spoke to those and basically outlined the intended way of completing that project. It will be a phased project, and we're hoping to award one contract. So we would have less risk and more accountability.
Thank you for that. And is it a fair assumption then that had Clifton Hunter and John Gray, etc., been done in a more traditional manner without all the change requests and orders, including the decision to go away from the traditional construction approach and the academy style approach, all those things culminated in a fait accompli, so to speak, in that there was no way, with all those changes, with all that kind of all these different parties, that this could have ever come out on time, on budget, and and for the benefit of the Caymanian children, basically, because that's really what we were trying to accomplish, right? Or that was what was stated. We're putting in top class facilities so that our children could have a better educational experience, and that at the end of the day, as a country, we would have buildings, etc., that matched our expectations and aspirations.
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's a very loaded question. And one that some of it I can't answer because I wasn't involved at the beginning of the project. I only got involved at 2009. But history has taught us that anytime there is actually a termination of a contract for whatever dispute it may have been, and you have to take a different route to complete the project, the final cost is usually escalated. And that's associated with many things, the delays, bad workmanship, the risk that the new contractor or contractors will be taking on. So there's many factors that would determine the final outcome being much more expensive and much more costly to the client than I have even alluded to here, because I don't know some of the design changes and why they were made, because I wasn't involved with the project at that time.
Any other questions for this witness? If not, Steve Banks, I thank you for your testimony and for appearing before the committee this morning to give your testimony. We'll excuse you at this time. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Members of the committee, we have reached the lunch break. We are running probably about 45 minutes behind time. My preference would be to take a shortened lunch break to try and get us back on track so that we can finish up at closer to the planned time, I think, of around 3 o'clock. That's still going to be difficult to achieve, but do we need would 30 minutes break for lunch be sufficient for everyone? Okay, let's plan to be back here at 1:15, which I think will just leave us, according to about 15 minutes behind schedule. And hopefully we should be able to make up and finish at the planned time of around 2:30, 3 o'clock. So if that's okay with everyone, we'll meet back here at 1:15 to conclude the sessions. Thank you.